Constitutional Enforcement Pre-Study Materials, Part 8. So you may be asking, why is a peacekeeping official higher in rank than a peacekeeping officer? And why are both higher on the totem pole than law enforcement officers? It's because, in the first case, peacekeeping officials are elected. A whole bunch of people examined a man's or woman's credentials and their attitude and their understanding of the job, and they approved of him or her to do the job. When you've got a beef with an elected sheriff or justice of the peace, you've got a beef with all the people who did the electing. And as for the second question, why do all peacekeeping officers outrank all law enforcement officers? It's because peacekeepers are public officers and LEOs are private officers. The focus of peacekeepers is to protect people and their property and to enforce the public law. The focus of law enforcement officers is to protect the corporation they work for and enforce private laws. About now a lot of the LEOs out there are bristling. They go out there every day and risk their lives as much as any peacekeeping officer, and many LEOs think of themselves as caring for people and protecting their communities, and to the extent that that is true, that's wonderful. However, the fundamental fact is that peacekeeping officers work for the public directly and are tasked to protect the public good and to enforce the public law. LEOs may work for the public indirectly as subcontractors, but there's a foreign, for-profit corporation acting as a middleman, and that corporation directs their actions and priorities. It protects itself and its self-interest first. Like the Supreme Court told Sheriff Mack, well, you can enforce the public law if you want to. And it's left for Sheriff Mack and men like him to hear the rest of the unspoken part of that message. You can enforce the public law if you want to, but it's not going to advance your career. It's not going to win you brownie points from the corporation you are working for. It's not a mandatory part of your job. When a LEO is working on a public contract, say, working as a state-of-state trooper in a typical public safety office, enforcing the public law surely should be a mandatory part of the job. The corporation he is working for is receiving public funds to do what appears to be a public job, so Joe Public is his ultimate employer, right? And Joe certainly intends for him to enforce the public law. That's what Joe Public is paying for and what Joe expects. Most of us assume that when you receive public money you work for the public and in a public capacity, but no, that's not how it works anymore. Foreign for-profit corporations have taken up a middleman position, inserted themselves in the cash flow stream, and they now dictate how our public money is spent. So they spend it on protecting themselves first and plumping up their profit margins second, and devil take the hindmost on all the rest. What do you expect? They are foreign, for-profit corporations. They are foreign, so they don't give a rat's rump about the people they serve. And they are here to make a profit. So these corporations calling themselves states of states, like State of California, spend your money which you allocated for the enforcement of your public law, on the enforcement of their private, corporate law instead. And guess what? Their private corporate law always favors them and it always involves statutes and codes and regulations. It doesn't involve public law at all. I have a good friend who is one of the most respected attorneys on the West Coast and a former state Supreme Court judge as well. He's about 30 years older than me and still sharp as a tack. He witnessed the unlawful conversion of our government firsthand back in the 60s when men like LBJ started handing out the federal kickbacks as bait to get the states and counties to incorporate. Here's a quote from him about it: "Nobody saw it coming. Nobody understood how it worked or what impact it would have, except of course, the attorneys. Those of us who had resisted the bar up to that point and continued to act as counselors of law gave up and decided to join the bar and pursue careers in contract law, because that's all that was left. When the state legislatures and county boards all stupidly voted to incorporate, they ceased to be public bodies. They went private, and most of the people voting for this, to say nothing of Joe Public, didn't know the consequences of doing this. Now I am going to repeat that so that everyone understands. When the state legislatures and county boards voted to incorporate, they became franchises like Dairy Queen franchises, of the foreign subcontractors who were already running their federal operations as commercial corporations. So, take in the view, our own federal states of states were mothballed and the British territorial subcontractors came in and very quietly substituted their own states of states organizations as a temporary emergency measure back in the 1860s. Soon after that, they incorporated these states of states organizations. and began running them as corporate franchises. Ever since then, these bodies, like the state of California legislature, have been pretending to represent the public, but are in fact private, foreign corporations merely in the business of providing governmental services. What you think of as your state legislature isn't your state legislature. It's nothing but a bunch of people elected to run a foreign for-profit governmental services corporation franchise, like a local dealership franchise of General Motors. It's not a public body, though it's pretending to be one, and it's merely claiming to represent you and your public interests. And thanks to LBJ, most of the counties in this country have been commandeered the same way. They had to incorporate as franchises of these foreign state-of-state organizations in order to get a share of all the federal kickback money that LBJ unleashed as federal block grants. In this way, via incorporation and enfranchisement and semantic deceit, these private corporate interests have endeavored and largely but not entirely succeeded in substituting their government for yours. It all happened in the twinkling of an eye, hinged on a single vote by people acting with no authority to convert your government, with no public debate, no public notice, and no full disclosure of what the ramifications would be. And now, as of December 21st of this year, they think that they are going to make all this legal chicanery, their illegal and unlawful, friendly corporate takeover of your government, a permanent arrangement benefiting themselves at your eternal expense. We need all the peacekeepers, all the Leos, and all military on our side on this. Every law enforcement agent, every federal employee, every state-of-state employee, every member of the American military, every sheriff, every peacekeeper, every Leo, and every member of the public has to wake up. It is really no surprise that these foreign, for-profit governmental service corporations have served themselves. They did this mainly by falsifying your identity for you, as we've seen, with the dead baby scam and the falsified master files and use of coercion under false pretenses to force you to enroll in Social Security and force you to sign up for selective service and all the rest of it. They also acted for you to take control of your water and power utilities, your natural resources, your commodity and currency markets, your hospitals and schools, and virtually every other public or private institution they could glom onto and administer. Oh, and of course, your public investments. All of these state-of-state corporations are absolutely immensely wealthy, because they have been siphoning off your wealth for decades while purportedly acting in your behalf. Last, but not least, they have taken away your rights and converted them into pay-for-play privileges. Driver licenses, marriage licenses, business licenses. And it's all bogus. It's all criminal. It's all commercial fraud and restraint of trade in one kind or another. Not surprisingly, then, these monsters in suits have also unlawfully converted public peacekeeping offices into private law enforcement offices. They have done this by defunding your public peacekeeping offices and paying for their private law enforcement offices with your money. They then use the Leos they've hired in your name to harass and intimidate you and do things like evict you from your homes when you fail to pay fraudulently constructed mortgages. All those nice people in the state-of-state legislature? Most of them are clueless. Most of them spend their days plowing through crap up to their eyeballs and listening to people complain. Most of them get paid a pittance and per diem. It's the same with the county board and all the various commissioners. They are just cogs in the wheel, like the judges who stare at me and say, but. That's the way we do it. That's the way we've always done it. Because they can't remember a time when things were done differently. There are, however, some criminal kingpins, some true king rats, embedded in or just outside of all these organizations. And, thankfully, they aren't hard to spot once you know what you are looking for. So, not surprisingly, the corporations representing our representative government have defunded our public offices and funded their private security services, their Pinkertons, instead. Now, the Leos aren't going to like this, but they are by definition corporate mercenaries, just like the Belgian shock troops going into Angola. They work for corporations on government contracts, which is not the same as working for the actual government. The state-of-state troopers, for example, are government corporation. Leos, as we have seen, they don't have any legal basis for their operations, as the Pinkerton laws like the 14th Amendment ceased to have any validity, public or private, in 1907. Most of what they do doesn't have anything to do with protecting railroads or mail services anyway. In fact, such gangs of men out patrolling our roads in squad cars and accosting and detaining us are acting under color of law and in a private de facto capacity repugnant to the public law, which does not even allow for such organizations to exist. Think about it. There's really no difference between the state of California and GM, except the kind of business and the size of the business. And what happens if we let every Fortune 500 corporation in America hire their own private army? Right. We devolve into a corporate gangland, with various groups of thugs fighting with other groups of thugs over turf and client base and profits. For that reason, private security forces, LEOs, that is, corporate mercenaries, had to be specifically allowed by an act of the Territorial Congress, and also for that reason, they were strictly limited to serve in the public interest to protect our railroads and mail service. Was that good or bad? Well, at best it's a slippery slope. Using public funds to fund private security forces may have had some justification if it was truly needed to protect public transportation and public mail service and public payrolls in the Old West, but there is really no reason to use private security forces for these functions. We could have just hired more federal marshals to do the job, or even deputized members of the militia. So why did we ever have Pinkerton laws? The answer goes back to British territorial influence and cronyism. The Pinkerton Agency was a British company and certain members of the Territorial Congress wanted to give them the fat contract. All police forces in this country are supposed to be operating as peacekeeping forces. If they get a dime of public source funding, they are in fact obligated to enforce the public law, but they aren't being directed nor encouraged to do so by the corporate middlemen. Instead, they are being misinformed and misdirected to protect the interests and bottom line of the corporations involved in this scheme. I'll give you a good example of it. I went with an elderly friend to the local state trooper's office to file a complaint about the abuse of driver licenses. When the secretary realized that we were giving notice and a report of unlawful activity, it's against the public law to license a natural right to travel on the public roads, and this has been affirmed many times, she called one of the troopers on duty. He was a young man, just out of the trooper academy. He came in all buff and bristling, jaw muscles working, gun at the ready, and he launched into a tirade about, "Are you one of them sovereign citizens?" "No," I replied mildly, staring at the spectacle of menace in front of me. Sovereign citizen is an oxymoron. You can be a sovereign and a citizen at the same time. "Why are you filing a report?" he sputtered angrily. "Because it is illegal and unlawful for you to be interfering with average Americans who are not members of your jural society and not employed by your corporation. It's not your job to restrict our right to travel. I am hired to enforce the law," he bellowed. "I think you will find that what you are enforcing is a state-of-state statute, which is not a public law of any kind." I paused. "And since you are hired using public funds, you owe your duty to me." "State statute is public law," he bristled. "No, sorry, it isn't. By definition." He got on his intercom and called for reinforcements against two little old ladies, one of them obviously all crippled up with arthritis and weighing less than 100 pounds. The whole scenario was ridiculous. When the other two officers, older men, came panting in and looked around for the threat, they were obviously confused. The young trooper was practically wheezing, he was so red-faced and angry. "Oh, Christ," said one of the older troopers, recognizing me. He grabbed the young trooper by the shoulder and marched him through a set of double doors. The remaining older trooper gave me a baleful, tired stare and said, "Why do you want to cause trouble?" He had a point, from his perspective. He deserved an answer that he could understand. "I'm doing my public duty," I said. "Right," he said wearily, staring out into space. Except for true ignoramus cases and greenhorns and corrupt company men in on the fix, Leos know that there is something wrong and they usually more or less admit it. They can sense it if nothing else. Like most people working in government jobs, they don't know what it is. It's up to the rest of us to teach them, because we all owe that same public duty, to ourselves and to each other. As my friend the old attorney said, every time a right gets converted into a privilege, we all lose. So we are not causing trouble when we object to bogus licensing demands and illegal registration demands. We, as members of the people, who are naturally not subject to any form of law meant to apply to corporations, not only have the right, we have the duty, to object to and resist improper demands made by employees of foreign for-profit corporations masquerading as our government. They may be subject to corporate public policies as a condition of employment, but the rest of us owe no such respect, compliance, or obedience. Uneducated employees of these corporations, however, believe that everyone owes the same obligations and is subject to the same law as them. We have to teach them otherwise. We have to teach ourselves and our children, too. Otherwise, we will have a generation of men like that clueless young state trooper, engaged in activity that is, strictly speaking, both illegal and unlawful, rampaging around insulting and threatening his employers and believing the whole time that he is an officer of the law, when in fact, at best, he is an officer of a law. He's not even aware of the actual public law. That rather precludes any ability on his part to enforce it. Most of us who are here, engaged in this training, are peacekeeping officials of one stripe or another, or, we are considering taking up the duty of peacekeeping, because we realize that this blight of corporatism and the so-called privatization of government is criminal in nature, is being promoted by foreign powers and foreign business interests, and will lead inevitably to the abject enslavement of ourselves and of our country if we don't all stand up and liquidate these paper dragons. We can, ironically enough, use the corporation's own apparatus to do this, just as they have used our money and gullibility against us. It is essential that Leos be brought up to speed and that the peacekeepers correct their own falsified records, declare their proper political status, and get themselves and their state assemblies organized. It is then of crucial importance that the state assemblies get their jury pools, court officers, and other actual government functionaries organized and operating. At the beginning, this will require a lot of volunteer effort on all our parts, and a vast educational effort as well. The Continental Marshal's Service is being trained to intercept, prevent, and prosecute crimes taking place in the international jurisdiction of the land. By definition, this includes interstate crimes, human trafficking, bank and securities fraud, counterfeiting, inland piracy, and similar offenses all fall under their bailiwick. So do prisoner transport and collection duties. The state militias are populated as part of the state assembly process and may be employed on a state and local basis for peacekeeping activities, including making citizens' arrests when necessary. The more common role of the state militia is to support the local county sheriffs as deputies when local manpower resources are tapped out or unavailable. The old-school sheriffs like Richard Mack still know their actual duty and still know the public law. They know how their power and their authority have been usurped, and now they know how justice itself has been undermined by the corporate plague. As more of them grasp what has actually happened here and see the way things are supposed to be versus the way things are, their motivation toward right action will increase, public support for their efforts will increase, and county government can be directly and expeditiously restored. It is to be hoped that the majority of men serving as Leos will come awake with a bump and assist our efforts, or at least recognize them for what they are, and not be misled or induced to take any action against us. We have proof that just as members of the FBI and other agencies are being lied to and presented with falsified documents, Leos serving as corporate sheriffs have also been lied to. A significant amount of propaganda money has been invested by the guilty corporations to educate Leos about the dangers of so-called sovereign citizens and hate groups and so on, and we have been painted with that brush often enough, or we wouldn't have had 3 beefy full-grown armed men bearing down on 2 elderly women, one of whom is so frail in body that she would blow away in a stiff wind. There are whack jobs of every description out there, and there are groups that want a violent insurrection against what is passing for our government, but the answer we embrace is to simply do our public duty and restore our government as it is meant to be. Only those guilty parties who have endeavored to pull off this corporate takeover scheme could object, and for obvious reasons, their willingness to do so will be curtailed by the realization that treason against our government by any means is a hanging offense. I anticipate that once the information I have shared with you becomes the common knowledge of Americans nationwide, the travesties which have haunted Washington, D.C. since 1865 will finally be set aside, our flag will appear in its proper orientation in the Capitol Rotunda, our people will come together again to put a final end to slavery of any kind, public or private, the issues of race and of second-class citizenship will be put to rest, the efforts to undermine our nation for the sake of corporate greed will be exposed for what they are, and a new, revitalized, motivated, and properly educated and directed cadre of local, state, international, and global peacekeepers will emerge. You all now stand on the cutting edge of what has been a very grim part of our history. America still stands. We are here to make sure she always will. End Part 8. End of pre-study materials.